Welcome back to the show. We're about to learn the secret sauce. Excellent. Gregor, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming over. You're like one of the few engineers I knew that were in LA. You've been here for a while.
We moved here in 2016. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, what is time? But we left the city for 2 years during COVID because of our kids. But yeah, it's been a while, and there are plenty of developers here. You have to come around.
Yeah, I'm making my rounds. We had quite a few people come through since we've been here. And the beauty about this podcast is you have no idea what location we're on because it's just a white wall.
Yeah,
it's perfect. But rather than talk behind the secret sauce, let's talk about you. And we usually start with an intro. Just tell the audience who are you and what do you do?
So hey, I'm Gregor. I'm a staff software engineer at GitHub. Right now, I work remotely my whole life, and only for the past year as an employee. Before that, independently as a founder and contractor. And I care very deeply about open source, which is why I care about GitHub, which is why I guess I ended up there.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. So I would love to know, talk of how you got to where you are today. So we can zoom back 10 years ago. I don't know if 10 years is a good point.
Yeah.
But how did you get involved in open source, just in general?
Let's go back to 2011-ish, I think, is when I started to get more involved into open source. I kind of just ended up another job, and I wanted to see what is out there. And I am a web developer. I kind of looked, what are the new APIs? And there was local storage and cache manifest. So, hey, we can build offline apps in the browser now. That I found really fascinating. And I built Minutes.io, this little, a meeting application.
Oh, I don't think I've heard of that one.
Minutes.io, it's still running. I hired my mom, it's paying her. So I might get back to it eventually.
Oh, it's just kind of on the shelf because running.
It's it's like a little software as a service. I don't have the time right now to invest more into it. But it might still happen. But what happened is that I needed a database for it because in the beginning it worked offline, but eventually people wanted accounts. They just didn't want to lose all their data when they, cleared the browser's cache.
Yeah.
And the moment you have an offline app which synchronizes, then you have the problem of synchronization. So I started out as a Rails app with a Rails backend with Postgres, and then I looked for a database system that would fit, and that was CouchDB. CouchDB is a database that replicates. It's basically built around very, very good peer-to-peer synchronization. So I found that, and I got pretty far, but there were some things missing. So I filled in the gaps with Node.js, with a Node.js middleware to create a sign-up flow and user authentication, authorization, data sharing, and stuff like that. And I went to a CouchCon first in San Francisco. That was summer 2013, I think, or 11. No, that was 11. We lived there for a short moment, and then in Berlin, where I met Jan Leonard, I think it's the product manager still of Apache CouchDB. And he loved my setup of CouchDB in Minutes. And he said, this is exactly what we were missing, and we should make this a thing. So together we created a project that eventually became Hoodie, which is a JavaScript database backend.
Wow. I didn't know that correlation to the story of Hoodie, which is amazing that so you built this offline experience for no developers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So basically we extracted the backend part, including the front end client from Minutes.io, and turned it into its own open source project. And I didn't know anything about open source, but Jan was already very involved, both in open source through Apache, but also in just the JavaScript community. He, around the time, created JSConf EU with some of his friends. And that, as we know, is a very great success story in terms of community organized events that are very inclusive, that care very deeply about everyone involved. So he applied the learnings of that into Hoodie. So Hoodie in 2011 or 12, from the get-go, we put a lot of priority into creating an inclusive space as an open source project. So we had like a code of conduct right away, which at that time was just not a thing. Like, the discussions only started to happen, and there was a lot of friction about it as we started to adding code of conduct into different tech communities. And yeah, so
Wait,
through
is that why the JSConf EU code of conduct is like the one everyone uses?
I don't know if that's the case, but I think it was for a long time.
Yeah,
the case.
Our open source's code of conduct was sourced from the JSConf EU.
Yeah,
because like back in 2018, it was like the one that everyone cited as like the example.
Yeah,
and okay, so the connection is really making sense for me right now.
Yeah, so through that we also were kind of very involved in the JavaScript community already. And we found a few more, people around us who kind of joined Hoodie, and we kind of hacked away with it. And eventually we came to the point where we had to figure out funding. Like, how do we fund an open source project? And 10 years later, it got much better. But it's still not an unsolved problem. But basically, our path was to create a company. So we founded Neighborhoodie, which still exists today in Berlin. They're still amazing about building solutions around offline first environments. And we founded it with basically the core team of Hoodie. So we tried to do contracting work and have some income, and at the same time use that revenue to build out Hoodie further as an open source project.
Excellent. Yeah. And it was I could see the branding in my head. It had like the dog with the hoodie on.
Yeah. It's amazing. It has amazing branding. And the open source project, I think, had very big reach, not because of its technology at all. We, from the beginning, we had a great kind of product manager and content creator, Lena Reinhardt, who really made a great career in tech. And then because of her, also others, whom we then invited and also paid to create these little cute dogs, like the low profile dog. They all have their names and stories and everything, which also was very intentional, was created because this is how we wanted people to feel that they are coming to this space, and they're not like developers and then the others. There's the dog's chicken, and there is the low profile dog, and oh my God, I don't know what else was there, but it was intentional about everyone is welcome and creating pathways for all kinds of different contributions and making clear that it's not developers and coders and non-coding contributions. It's that it's on eye height, it's developers, designers, content creators, and so on. Everything, making everything equally important. So I took away a lot from that throughout my entire career.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few projects who I could cite the success on just by their sheer brand and their experience in the industry, or as you onboard onto the project. There's an experience, it's welcoming, or there's a low profile dog or a sticker that you found at a conference. And at the end of the day, I don't know if this is your opinion, but my opinion is that open source, the successful projects tend to have a bit more marketing. And if it's not intentional marketing, it's the engineering. It markets itself because it shows up in a place that people want to talk about it. And where offline applications back in 2011 to 2015, maybe not a thing that everyone was interested in or needed at the time, they were attracted to that, to the stickers, the dog, and etc.
And there are a lot of people who want to contribute to open source. You just have to go where they are and find them, And when you're an open source project, you have an interesting technology project, there's opensourcedesign.org, I think, still, and I'm sure a lot of other communities.
Ariel Fox runs that, I believe, or is that the different program?
I don't know. But invite these people to your project. Make it nice for them to be there. Make them feel appreciated. Or if you have funding, as a company, yes, sure, pay the people. but there is a lot of people who would like to get involved in open source as a means to grow personally, to like meet other people outside of their work and other circles, build out their portfolio. There are many reasons for it, and by making it more inclusive to contributors other than coders, you just can tap a whole new world of people and perspectives. And when you manage to make them excited about your mission, what you're trying to achieve, you will have a much bigger reach.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah. And so like the hoodie started in Berlin at the first?
Yeah, like I would say so. I think I lived in Zurich at the time. My wife, she did her PhD, but kind of Berlin was the rest of the people, and I would take the train every now and then from Zurich to Berlin and back. So if you wanted to meet in person, but definitely Berlin was the headquarter and still is for Neighborhoodie, the company.
Okay. And then the fascinating thing is like the amount of projects that came out of Neighborhoodie. So you had mentioned in passing your experience with Greenkeeper, and then you're like, oh yeah, it also came out of Hoodie. So talk about like as you were approaching the problem, you guys built a company, and then you had to build other things to then make the company make sense.
Yeah. Well, these are maybe two different things, but what happened with Hoodie, once we kind of figure out what the whole system is, like this backend, offline first and backend, it was a mess in terms of code. It was very hard to understand, to maintain, and so on. So we had to clean it up. And we were thinking, okay, how can we make this as contributor friendly as possible? And one solution we came up with is we have to decompose it into smaller modules. So out of one big repository, we maybe at the end had like 12 or 15. But then the people who only cared about the front-end SDK, they had like one repository which only had the code for it, and it had its dedicated README, its dedicated testing. It was a much simpler setup. You didn't need any CouchDB and stuff like that. However, by optimizing for contributors, we really increased the burden of maintenance.
Yeah.
Because now you have these different repositories, and you make a release here, and then you need to update the other repositories, and then another. It's like 3 to 4 layers. So we, at the time of the company, had interns, actually. There was Stefan Böhnemann, who...
from Contentful and...
Yeah.
Is that the same Stefan I'm thinking of? He's in Berlin.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, yeah, he worked at Contentful, I think.
Yeah, he works at another startup now. But
so he was one of the people working at Neighborhoodie, and I think that he was basically the person with. I'm sorry, I'm lacking on the other name. We had another intern, and they together created both Semantic Release and Greenkeeper, like its initial versions, out of the need of how can we have these separate repositories in order to be contributor friendly, but at the same time lower the barrier of maintenance overhead. And these are, until this day, I would say the most important things as like release automation and dependency updates. And Greenkeeper and Semantic Release were exactly this solution, and it evolved greatly since then. I mean, Greenkeeper, rest in peace. Did
it officially shut down?
Yeah, it officially shut down. It got acquired by Snike.
Okay.
Snike?
I say Sneak, but they say Snike.
Yeah.
So we'll say Snake.
Okay, we say both so people will know what we mean. But since then, like basically GitHub came out with their built-in dependabot solution. So that was kind of, it. And Semantic Release is still out there and thriving. And I'm like one of the maintainers of Semantic Release.
It's interesting that Greenkeeper though was it clear that Greenkeeper had a paid opportunity than Semantic Release then?
Yeah, I think because is still, even for dependabot, like the security aspect of it.
Yeah.
So we created like an enterprise version of Greenkeeper, which not only worked with the public NPM registry, but also with private packages and private registries and so on. So there was a different avenue. For Semantic Release, I don't know if we really considered it. We could only do so much at once.
Yeah.
So we tried Greenkeeper kind of as a service, CouchDB support was one thing, and then we just worked on different projects as the company Yeah.
Okay. So that was the sort of makeup of what Hoodie ended up outside of the offline application, the tooling part,
Yeah.
Greenkeeper, semantic release, and then some CouchDB support.
Yeah. Mostly that was basically it that I think came out of Hoodie. Yeah.
And did Hoodie ever take VC fund or anything like that? It was just always.
No. I mean, we also had like a very anti VC stand, I think.
Yeah.
We really like the German Mittelstand. And we want to be.
What is that?
Okay, German Mittelstand is basically family-owned companies, which are like the middle tier of companies.
Oh.
Some of them are big, some of them have
Like
1,000
Adidas.
employees, but where the owners of the company, maybe own this company over generations, and they care deeply about not only the company, but also their employees, the society around them. And this is something that existed in a German society over a long, long time. Like apprenticeships, is a very big thing in Germany. It's part of the system. It's connected with schools and so on. And yeah, it has been around for a very long time in Germany. And we said, like, this is what we want to do. We want to do high-tech stuff, but we want to be very accountable towards our people and the people around us. And this is the right path for us. So we try to, self-fund it.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Have you seen the movie Air yet?
No.
Yeah, Air is basically about Michael Jordan getting in the shoe deal and the guys at Nike basically trying to get him to sign instead of signing to Adidas, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point was when I guess the family all the siblings had taken over, or I'm not sure who they all were, but that was like one of the reasons why MJ didn't go to Adidas, is because there was like no clear leadership. It was like the entire family had their own thing, no proper CEO. Anyway, I imagine there was like way more nuance to that story that connects with the German Mittelstands.
Mittelstand, like middle is like the middle, and Stand is the stand. So it's kind of like I don't know how you call it in English. There's like small business and there are like the huge corporations.
SMB.
So what is,
small, medium business.
Medium business, I would say. But also in particular, many of them are family owned.
Okay.
And that is an important aspect of it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. So, I mean, what happened? We know what happened to Hoodie. Like now it's still chugging along, doing stuff. And we know what happened to Greenkeeper. So what happened to Gregor? Like, you don't work there anymore.
So I worked basically independently and remotely my whole career since like 2002 or something. And that permitted me to move around with my wife as she made her career. And she was in Zurich, which was close-ish enough to Berlin. She did her PhD. And after that, we went to the East Coast, to Boston, Cambridge. And, I was just able to move with her. But I was one of the founders of the company, Neighborhoodie, and it kind of like, now we had like a 6 hours time difference with the East Coast, which already made it hard. And then after a year, we moved to the West Coast. And that is 9 hours. And like, it just didn't work out, not in the way I wanted to be involved.
Yeah.
But even before I moved to the West Coast, Brandon Keepers kind of approached me saying like, hey, I want to build out this OctoKit program and we want to do it with these different SDKs. We want to hire like maintainers for like the top 10 to 20 language ecosystems. We want to start with JavaScript and I think you would be perfect. And I said, sure. In the beginning, I started it out as part of Neighborhoodie, but then as we split, I basically took over OctoKit to myself and work as a 1099 contractor and did some other gigs as well. But then 2018, my triplets arrived.
I was going to say Microsoft took over, but
that
you
too.
had kids too as well.
So yeah, I started OctoKit in like 2017-ish. Which, it's not only the kids arrived in July, but because it was a triplet pregnancy, it was complicated. So like during the pregnancy already, like that was like my biggest priority, of course. And by the time they arrived, I was glad to be able to just say, well, I just will work half time now and be available for my family and do mostly OctoKit on the other half, but also be very independent that was just a perfect work setup for me. And it was great because I could continue to work on open source, and a lot of more work or more open source projects came out of that time, and me working on OctoKit, mostly because it's basically, a wrapper around GitHub's platform APIs. And if you're an open source maintainer, you're most likely on GitHub. And if you want to automate your chores, you will need to interact with GitHub APIs. So it was perfect for me because I knew through the OctoKit work exactly what was possible and how. And I could basically build the tooling or like the underlying fundamentals that I would need to then automate more stuff with my open source work so that I could keep maintaining stuff.
Yeah, this makes so much sense now that I have like all the threads for me and in your story. And also this one note, Brandon Keeper's longtime engineer at GitHub. He was acquired through another acquisition and then was early GitHub acquired company employee. Now sailing boats. I don't know, what is Brandon doing nowadays?
Yeah, he's it's Captain
Captain
Keepers now.
Captain Keepers, yeah.
He's sailing, sailing the seas and building software for sailboats. I think. Shout out to Brandon. Thank you for everything you did, and I'm still jealous of your title, Director of Open Source at GitHub. I think it's just the coolest title ever.
Yeah, and he honestly he had such a great team. The team that actually was hired into was like a portion of that team with Nadia and Mike as well, and John Britton, and so John absorbed some folks from Brandon, and then post acquisition, Brandon decided to go set sails. Literally after an acquisition, a lot of people sail off in the sunset, figuratively, but like he literally did it.
Yeah,
he
good for them.
Big in the sailboats.
Yeah.
But it can't be understated that the OctoKit ecosystem is pretty nice. Like I didn't realize it was 2017. I felt like it was just there forever. But by the time I started using it in 2017, I felt like, oh wow.
Yeah.
Because at the time, previous to that, I worked at Netlify. And we had our own SDK file, like was this basically called GitHub.js or whatever. And we built a bunch of wrappers around the API. And that's how Netlify worked for years. And I don't know if they switched to OctoKit, but when I got to GitHub and saw OctoKit, I'm like, why was I not using this thing? This thing is so much better.
They better switch, yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is like, even the one thing I always like kind of blew me away is like how you kept up to date with the API changes. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, OctoKit was there before I came. It was just a Ruby OctoKit and I think .NET. And then I came in with JavaScript, and we kind of took the project that had the most stars, which is not always the best idea, but it is what it is. So we adopted like the GitHub package, I think, and started from that, and eventually, similarly, we had on one episode, from Next.js, where he explained like he basically, took the plane apart and put it together on flight. And that's what we did with OctoKit as well. Like eventually the original package was like 20,000 lines or something. And we took it apart and put it together with very little friction. And now it's just like 10 lines of code, which just composes the different modules that can now be used separately. And for me, working on this myself and also being kind of the trailblazer, like, I was hired not only to create the OctoKit JavaScript, but also with the prospect of, there will be 20 more people coming after me. So all the shared problem that I thought, would be useful for other maintainers as well, I try to solve in a way that is not only relevant to JavaScript, but also to the other systems. And what I did is I created a crawler that would go through the documentation of the REST API of GitHub every night and would extract machine-readable, data of it, like some custom-made JSON, which eventually we turned into an OpenAPI compatible specification. And then having that as a kind of, a separate project, which others could use as well, and then use that in order to generate the JavaScript OctoKit. And this is how I could, keep up to date very, very quickly. As long as the docs were up to date, the SDKs were up to date. It was like an important problem. And and eventually GitHub adopted the OpenAPI specification, made it much better, and started generating even the docs out of the OpenAPI specification. So these things got even closer, and I no longer had to like maintain this crawler, you know?
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Anyway, like if you maintain docs or you have your own OpenAI spec, like definitely take a look at this work, because it inspired so much more work that I even did. Because like I got to benefit doing DevRel at GitHub. A lot of the work you did, like to put together a quick little demo, like the webhook tool, OctoKit webhook.
Yeah.
And we built Twitch integrations on top of that. And it was made so trivial that anybody watching our Twitch stream could be like, oh yeah, I can clone this and get started really quickly. And like having all the pieces like sort of composable makes it a very interesting story to like now teach integrators GitHub, which was like my first role at GitHub was marketplace integrations. Like how do you build the story to get people to do that? And then GitHub Actions came along and that became my focus. But then I'm curious, like, from your purview where you were at doing OctoKit, like GitHub Actions kind of changed the game about GitHub integration. So like, were you part of those conversations, or were you just sort of chugging along on the side?
No, I chatted along on the side. You know, at this time I had other priorities, but I loved it. Like for me, I'm not a DevOps person, like running my own servers. Like thank God, you know, for Netlify and Universals, that just Heroku before that enabled someone like me build out their stuff out there. But with Actions, it made it so simple by putting like a YAML file in a folder of my repository, and suddenly I could like run code. Yeah, that changed the game. It changed the game of open source maintenance as well, definitely. But it's not the end of apps. You know, like a GitHub application, it's just a means of authentication. It's not like, it's kind of confusing because people call GitHub app both the thing you register on github.com and then you get your app ID and private key back, and like webhook secret. These are just credentials. And then people call GitHub app also some kind of server that you're running that receives webhooks. But you don't need that part. So technically you can run GitHub apps from GitHub Actions. Which is confusing, but you have very interesting use cases.
We do at OpenSauce, thanks to you actually showing it to me. So as a GitHub employee, when I was building OpenSauce, like you were just blowing my brain. Every time we chat, it'd be like, oh yeah, you could do this. And then like our entire indexer. So anything OpenSauce Actions, that repo, like was our original conversations around running a GitHub app on GitHub Actions. And then any installed GitHub app, we can then crawl to do updates, which makes a lot of sense, and a lot of tooling you had built. But also I'd seen a lot of people do like randomly like open an issue on a repo that you had to install an app, and I didn't know you could do that stuff. And like once you really dig in, which honestly we take a step back, like you mentioned Brandon and Probot, but we didn't really talk about the idea of GitHub apps as well, which is like it was a big change for GitHub to like unveil and roll out these applications. So like, were you after apps were shipped?
No, I came just around the same time. Okay. So Probot was created when GitHub apps were announced, and that was mostly Brandon Keepers, Jason Etko, you know, who's still with us, and a few other people who worked on Probot as a means to create like a framework to build GitHub apps. And only slowly after that, I came from the OctoKit side because I was busy with building crawlers and whatnot. To then again like replace the foundation of Probot step by step with actually OctoKit, to the point where Probot is just like an opinionated composition of OctoKit components, which is exactly the way it should be, so that you have an opinionated framework. You can build a GitHub app with just a few lines of code, but when you outgrow a framework's scope, you should be able to eject the framework and then use the underlying tooling, and that is what we made possible now.
This is maybe I'm way more excited about this conversation, maybe even our listeners, but like there's a lot of folks who I help support in these conversations, and like a lot of startups who are like, we want to build this thing, how do we build this interaction? Superbase being one of them. Like early days, they wanted to build an ecosystem where you can just authenticate with GitHub and have interactions and build an entire database on top of it. And a lot of that knowledge I was able to like unveil to these folks was through a lot of our interactions and a lot of Probot interactions. So like Bex being one of the members of the team that interned, but also helped support Probot at the time. Jason Ecto as well, being another person I always had their ear, asking questions, and even a few other folks. Like it seemed like at the time, like the GitHub interns, like Mark Terashati as well.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm thinking about the other guy who does the Slack integration.
Oh yeah, Wilhelm.
Yeah, well,
Kopp.
yeah,
and there was Bex too.
Yeah,
Bex I think they are at Twilio now.
Yep.
These are all amazing.
And Nathaniel
people.
as well.
Yeah.
D12. It was just it was like a lot of energy around the GitHub apps, and then Microsoft acquired us, and then everything sort of like ellipse, like this sort of TD. Like we'll figure out what happens next.
Yeah,
and, I do see a bit of a resurgence in the GitHub app space as you see more and more startups sort of like try to do their sort of interaction with the GitHub, because GitHub's an interesting place where it's just everyone uses it.
I always wanted GitHub to be a backend for open source communities. It kind of makes sense. And it's not only about release automation and dependency, automation. It brings all these fascinating things like the entire flow of pull requests where you can set rules of who has to review what. But now imagine you can build a custom UI that is specific to content creators. You writing a blog post or something. And yes, there are like other tools that you can use for that.
Yeah.
But I would really like to build more very thin wrappers around just GitHub, where yes, you log in with your GitHub account, and then you don't need to go through like the pull request UI and the github.com UI. Instead of you have a UI that is perfectly tailored to where you're coming from. You have a great, maybe collaborative editing experience. And when you're done, you submit it. And in the backend, it's using all branch protection rules and pull requests. This is where the developers are at home, and they love that. But for content creators, they will have an entire different experience. Or, for example, I built like a Hacker News clone, like Octonews, that is basically just another path to contribute to an open source community. Like sharing resources that are relevant to your community, that is a great way to have a very low bar means of contribution. I wanted to build it where GitHub is basically the backend, and you just have a small custom UI where you submit links, but in the behind it, it's just basically pull request flows and reactions and whatnot.
Yeah, this about open source. Our original backend was the repository. Like everyone gets a new repository as a new open source user. We've since moved away from this because we didn't hit scaling issues, but like we definitely had like a lot of chewing gum and duct tape to make it work. And honestly, I wouldn't mind rebuilding it from the ground up because, we just had a lot of since 2017, it worked sort of.
Engineers always want to be rebuilt. It's tempting, But and you bring up an interesting point, because I think this is the biggest point of friction. As soon as you need some kind of stateful integration, it becomes complicated. And I wish like GitHub would provide some kind of minimalistic key value store, like very, very simple. Then we would need all these different hacks, like injecting HTML comments into, issues and comments and stuff like that to keep some kind of state, just because we don't want to maintain our own database.
Yeah.
I wish we could solve
that's
that,
what, honestly, used to work at GitHub.
Yeah.
The GitHub gist is like, that's like everyone's sort of stateful data management where you get a one-off gist. And funny enough, like for the longest time, Netlify's streaming logs were printing to a GitHub gist. Huh. And you get a lot of persistent. I don't know how long they left that up, but when I left in 2018, we still used that. But there's definitely a ton of other tools you could use instead.
Or like I wish there would be more investment in Probot and kind of turn it into a service, which is like out in the open, so you can invite all these integrators. But then Probot as like a GitHub app, service could then say, you basically get some little data storage for free as part of the framework, but you can also, bring your own, no problem. This is how it works. I think this is the layer where this should happen.
But it kind of seems like they've kind of introduced pieces of Probot in different. I don't know if it was intentional, but like with GitHub Actions, that became my integration platform. So instead of building a whole app, like I can just do an action, it works. But then with Probot, now there's slash commands as well, which was like always my first demo. Probot was like, hey, let's just label an issue and do a thing. Now GitHub has slash commands where you can just do a thing. I actually haven't used them yet since leaving GitHub, so I don't know how customizable they are.
Yeah, I was, as you say, I work at GitHub, so I kind of bring in the open source and integrators perspective still wherever I am. So when I hear slash commands, I'm kind of trying to, hey, can we please make it so that apps can register their own slash commands?
Yeah.
So that, the open sourced app, when you install it, you now get like a custom slash command, and you can interact directly with the app. Yeah, that would be useful, but I was not yet successful enough to get that going. But maybe one day.
It took me about a year to get enough pull to people to listen to me.
Sometimes you just have to build stuff, hack it together so that you can show it and use that as leverage.
Honestly,
build it into the product.
And we want to take a step into how the hierarchy of GitHub works. My secret sauce for working at GitHub, which you can't do anymore because the office is going to shut down, is every Thursday I'd go have lunch in the office, or every other Thursday. And that's though Tuesday people get hired. Thursday is the first day when you're hired. You don't have like a thing to do. It's just like your last day of freedom before you go back home. So I would just go have lunch in the office and meet every new person. And then a year into their trajectory, like, oh yeah, you're doing that cool thing now, or you're working on this project. We met a year ago. And then I just get pulled within a bunch of teams and like a lot of PMs and engineers. And then that's how I would just kind of inject energy into things I thought would be important, which is, it's funny to say this out loud because like looking back, people might be like, oh yeah, B Dougie. There's a reason why he was a Beyonce of GitHub. Like he was behind pulling strings, but not always did it work out. But it was just give first, which we always had like a platform on developer relations to be like, hey, come talk to us. We'll do a thing. Come speak at this event. And then it'd be like, oh, we need webhooks for reactions. How can we get that done? Which unfortunately has not been done yet.
I asked for it on the day GitHub apps were introduced, I think, basically.
Yeah, it'd be amazing is to do a heart, and that each heart is followed up with like a workflow. There was never a proper PM on that feature that I could talk to. And engineers, not that engineers lost their sort of pull, but like less stuff went through engineering and went through PMs. So if you didn't have a PM, it's harder to get the justification in certain things.
But it's complicated, of course, but I will never stop rooting for GitHub. Like my career wouldn't exist without the open source on that platform. So even if it's hard at times, especially, like for the past half a year or so, when just people will let go and it was kind of vague, and it's still that way. But everyone there, the people are great. But surprisingly, there are not so many people who are actually using GitHub outside of their work. Like that is something that surprised me a little bit. Which is, surprising, but it's also an opportunity for me. And I try to inject myself into places to make sure that this perspective gets not overseen. So GitHub cares greatly about open source, but I think like people lack the experience of being a maintainer on open source sometimes. I want to represent, shout out to all my maintainers out there. I'm fighting a good fight for you.
Yeah. And honestly, that's one of the nicest part about being at dev tools and companies that support developers. Like when you yourself feel the pain of like, oh, we moved the button or this thing is now set up this way, there needs to be that person that can help shepherd, which the one thing I loved about being part of the developer relations team is like, I was part of that sort of shepherding the news and getting in front of folks before things change or before we ship things like Copilot. I got to meet 20 of the most impactful people in the industry and say, hey, we have a thing. Would you like to see it before you launch it? And that was like a thing I loved and enjoyed. But I do also realize like as the company progresses and matures and grows, like there are less maintainers who are engineering teams and sort of fighting the good fight like yourself. And there needs to be more. So like if you are a maintainer, apply for one of the open roles and then start building up your credibility internally and ship some really cool features. Yeah. So what's your thought on the sort of, you mentioned you're at GitHub. You love GitHub because of your career. But do you think GitHub ever has an opportunity to like become the second tier solution. Because like we have all this machine learning stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when I think about machine learning, like yes, a lot of people host their stuff on GitHub, but now all these other tools like Hugging Face and Replicate. Actually, it's only two I know, to be honest.
Yeah.
But now there's other places for people to even talk about data science. So do you think there's like a world where GitHub, like people end up doing something besides GitHub?
I'm sure they do and they should, you know, like keep GitHub on their toes as well. But as long as GitHub is the place where community happens and all these other tools are kind of built around it and feed into that, I think GitHub is in a pretty good place. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, the beauty is that GitHub keeps evolving.
Yeah.
So like it's very different GitHub than 5 years ago, at least when I joined. And I think that if GitHub doesn't continue to evolve, then there's an issue.
Yeah.
Like if we're also trying to be just the Git hosting platform and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, but sometimes, you know, it's also contradictory. Like for one side, GitHub, we want to be the place for every developer. So we care deeply about accessibility, which is also a blocker for huge organizations and, you know, big corporations where they have certain requirements. But at the same time, we want everyone to be able to use GitHub. But that slows us down. Like now we're building these features, it takes longer. And also we have this interactivity, which might seem a little bit more clunky sometimes.
Yeah.
Like maybe you need more clicks than with, you know, linear or like other alternative tooling, but they do not adhere to the same amount of accessibility certifications than we do. So there is a trade-off, and there will always be a space for like smaller places, you know, that have a very tailored, very fast experience for certain aspects of it. But I still think it's the right call for GitHub. Like if they're really true to their mission, it is the right call. Even, you know, when it pains me that like I want all these things and it's just so slow. And I understand that other things need to be prioritized. But in the long run, it's the right call. And, you know, GitHub has been around for 15 years or so. They probably will be around for another 15 years.
Yeah. Exciting.
I'm sorry. I'm like making an advertisement for GitHub now. I'm really passionate about the product and the people. But most of all, I'm passionate about open source. And if open source moves away to something else, then I will move as well, you know. And I don't want it to happen. Like this is why I'm within GitHub, and I try to address the problems and the pain points that we are seeing that are growing. It's just, you know, you reach a new foundation, you think you did a good job, but then people find new things to complain. So you gotta keep evolving, as you're saying, because other smaller startup companies will come in and eat your breakfast. And we should talk about open source more, because I think like everything that open source is doing, I wish GitHub was doing.
Let's talk about open source. We actually don't spend a ton of time in these conversations talking about open source, but I know you like what we're doing, and I'm curious to even get your take, even recorded on the podcast, of like our approach to data insights, but also connecting the developer. So I've been using the term human dependency graph as like you see a project, like you want to find out who is maintaining and contributing to the project, but also like what your pathway to maintaining, contributing to that project as well. And that's something that's always been kind of, if you know, but if you don't, then it's like very hard to get in to do open source and make a contribution. So like, what's your thought on the sort of state of what we're doing and the current ecosystem?
I see and applaud open source efforts to basically be the space to go when you have the questions, how do I contribute to open source? I think like you're very invested in it, in both like documentations and tooling and outreach and so on. And that is wonderful. And it just becomes ever more so important. And after that, there are so many unanswered questions, you know, like given this transparency, who is behind these open source projects? It is not only relevant to new contributors, it's also relevant to like companies. Like, are these people, you know, will they be around? Like, is this a company funded project? Is this like some, you know, project run by students that might like dissolve the group next year or something like that? And then, where do I promote myself better as an open source contributor or maintainer? It now becomes a career path, which I'm super excited to see. Like we're starting the first people who are able to do this, and they're not very representative. There are certain kind of people who can afford this, but I hope that they are paving the paths for many other people, more diverse people, to follow. And then it is very important to have a way to promote the work you're doing beyond what GitHub can do, because like the green blocks, that's not enough. Like the highlights, I think, feature you have in open source is something that makes a lot of sense to me. Or kind of like I think we talked about like how we need like a LinkedIn feature, a system for open source.
Summarize the work you've done in a way that's like, it's not even just a sort of resume, but it's also like if you're contracting, so like a lot of your work has been dependent on a company paying you for the work that didn't help support your open source. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you have to summarize your work. I don't know how it is for you when you have to summarize, like, hey, I did these 10 PRs.
Yeah.
But even unless you're running your own scripts or, generating whatever that form is to submit your work, like that also doesn't exist. Like the sort of contractor to contributor experience, like in tooling, also doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know this, I cite this, I know one company in particular who has a team of contractors they work with to help do upstream contributions. And the work of just getting them to tell them, what have you done? Like, what invoice us? Just invoice us based on the work. Mm-hmm. But as a contributor or just a independent, I write code, like, let's 12 hours. I don't know. Like, just throw out a number, but that's even hard for some people because like all they want to do is ship some code.
Yeah.
But there's no tooling unless you're a full on contractor and like this is your thing and you've done it for a while.
Yeah.
Like there should be a pathway for people to come out of a boot camp or come out of college and just generate an invoice.
Yeah. And I mean, I could talk about this for forever, all kinds of other tooling that I hope like open source will adopt. But in general, these are the problems. Like I want to know who are the contributors in the project. Like GitHub has insights, but it's only about code, mostly about code and maybe issues. But there are other means of contribution. And I want to know from the perspective of the maintainers, like through their kind of weighted, through their endorsements, to say like, yes, this is a significant contributor. For example, like for OctoKit, I started to heart. As you started, using the heart emoji just to kind of bookmark even comments or pull requests or whatever. And then I had a script, and once per month, it would need to, go through massive amount of data to find like these places. And then I have to go through all these URLs and like write my reports and say thank you.
Yeah.
For like.
So you run a thank you report.
Yeah. And this is not something you want to automate, right?
Yeah.
Like CI is great for automation, like telling people that their syntax is wrong. But if you want to appreciate people, that's not something I want to automate. I want tooling to help me build this out.
Yes.
But then I want to go in and not only say, hey, thank you, because here's a link to your comment. I want to say, hey, thank you. I really appreciate this. This is the impact that you had. It takes much more time, but
it's a meaningful experience.
It is very meaningful. And this is how I think we onboarded several great contributors to different projects over time.
Yeah. So I actually we do a welcome message to folks when they make their first contribution, and it is automated, but I've always wanted to like track how many welcome messages we send out to do something like a thank you report, to be like, hey, team, like we have a triage team, and the triage team is like our first responder basically. And the idea is like triage team be first responders, like help siphon people into the Discord, help them introduce or mention me and be like, oh, so-and-so made a good contribution. Cause like sometimes we'll get like 3 of them in a week, and I'll be traveling or something will happen and I just don't know what's happened. And if you ever been a GitHub employee, you know your notifications on GitHub can be a bit much. So it's not as easy just going through your mentions.
Yeah.
But if I had like a Google sheet that was like, here are the lists, and like, which ones have I not responded to? Who have I not
like up to a point where, I want like a CRM, for my open source project in a way. And I know there are like other projects who try that, where we can kind of keep track of people who contribute. And I don't mean to automate all this stuff, but it helps me as a maintainer with the short amount of time to make a decision into whom can I invest more. Like in Howie, sometimes I would just go in as soon as there was a good contribution, and I would ask them, hey, do you want to do a call?
Yeah.
Totally random. Like, and this doesn't scale, but it's enough if I would do it once or twice per month. And many of these were just interesting and then nothing happened. But I think most of the contributors who stuck with us for longer are the ones that I had a personal call with or someone else from the team. And it's a great thing you could do. But then I also want to write it down, like in some kind of private maintenance space, like, hey, I talked to, Jennifer today. This is what we discussed. And this is important things this is things that Jennifer cares about, and so on.
Yeah.
There is no space for that right now.
It's, honestly, I honestly didn't even think about this, because as you roll off a maintainer, someone else comes on, people have other things to do. And like, if it's all unpaid work, it's right for them to move on and do things. But a lot of time that knowledge about Jennifer goes off with that maintainer. So like there should be sort of like a log to be able to say, okay, I talked to this person, this is our interactions, this is the work they've done. And so usually what happens is like, oh wow, there's a thing we haven't touched in a while. Who knows how this works? And the idea there is like, we should like have some sort of like list of experts. Like I've always wanted to do the, which I don't know if if anybody does this, like the code owners file. Like I don't just generate that. Like generate who are like my top 10 people who have touched this folder. And then how can I source like the people I should be reaching out to when I need to start like onboarding people or talking to experts about this particular folder. Yeah. And I think with a lot of like Lerna, and which I guess Lerna is still around, I don't remember it, but Turbo is another one. Like all the Monorepo projects, just a lot of information in the one project, which is like, I guess the inverse of where you're coming from, where you built all the sort of micro services to support the one project. It's hard to like find out who owns what. Yeah. And it's very rare to have the one person who knows it all. Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have any institutional knowledge, as you say, and people leave and it's gone. And I don't want like super professionalize open source, but I would like to have an option where like an open source project comes to a certain point. And also many open source maintainers will tell you, what we need in open source is product managers. Yeah. Like, please, product managers come, but I can understand, like, they have better things to do. Why should they contribute to open source, that's the ththing that I think they're not even aware how much they are wanted. But then when someone comes, like, what can I give them? GitHub.com is not perfect. I know they're trying with projects a little bit, but there is, tooling that they are used to working with that we don't really have. And I think for this to work in open source, it needs to be deeply integrated with GitHub. And that's the kind of stuff I would love to see, to create a place for more project and product managers. And open source would be so much better for it if we had like community contributions that really does product and project managers work. And fundraising, man, there is so much. Yeah. You want to fundraise, if you're good at fundraising, all these open source projects, they just need someone to do it and they could raise a lot of money. You just need to know what you want to do with it as well, which is a whole different discussion. I always allude to is like open source it's really around marketing. It's around product management. It's like having open source, the success of open source usually is lined into people doing product management really well or people doing marketing really well. And it's not like you have to be a marketer, but like anybody who gets up on stage at a JSConf EU, like that becomes the market. Like every year you got stuff you can talk about at JSConf. It's like, oh, here's a cool new React feature or a new Vue feature. Like that becomes a place that they get validation that this is something they could use. But there are so many projects out there that have no platform, like to go talk about a thing, and they don't have, a bunch of nice cameras and an editor to be able to talk about their project in a way that people could discover it. So then it becomes, okay, there could be a pathway or a platform, but then we start looking at all the toolings. Like you mentioned Open Collective in passing, like for like fundraising, Titleist's another one. They're all disjointed. And I think there are a good effort of like having the OSI helps like coordinate and have conversations across these ecosystems and organizations. Yeah. But then now it becomes education. Okay. You're a maintainer. You got 100,000 stars in one day because of Hacker News. Now what? And then it becomes an education problem where they didn't know there was an ecosystem for them to like plug into
Yeah.
unless someone reaches out to them.
Yeah, man, I wish there was a service somehow,
Yeah.
Like there are like also like maintainer conferences and stuff, but
Yeah.
it's great to create these forums and, especially like Open Collective, like they created like a community event basically about fundraising and open source.
Yeah.
Sustainers, wonderful.
Yeah.
And I met a lot of great other, fellow maintainers there. But it's quickly evolving, and there are all these tooling and best practices. And as a maintainer, I barely have the time, to keep up with like security updates. But I do have, at least when a project grows a certain size, I do have potential funding. And if there was like a group of people that would basically come in that are, paid, that do not only help, like they don't need to understand the code.
Yeah.
I rather have social workers, who understand communication, who help, make sure that there is nothing off track, that code of conduct is enforced, but also who bring in the knowledge of the industry and say, hey, you know what is great to do to onboard new people? Like organize an event, for example, and we can help you with that and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
Or like, hey, if you want to fundraise, like here are a few things you can do. Like these are steps. Or to identify pain points, and as the existing maintenance team, we don't need to do anything. They just go in and implement it, like certain automations, like stale issues and stuff like that they could do, which would be great. And one important thing as well is, or two important things is onboard maintainers and offboard maintainers. Like the whole situation of, you are a maintainer in a project, you're kind of a gatekeeper oftentimes you don't want to be, but also you don't have the time to onboard some random people because you're afraid that like the millions of downloads this package has will fall into the hands of someone you don't know, and they could really cause damage, right? So how to do that? And I wish I could do that with the projects that I maintain, but I cannot do it by myself. And I wish I could, pay someone to help that, not only one project, but across all my projects.
Yeah, it's almost like I can only think of like whatever the secular terms, the non-open source terms, like the broker or the agent, or it's sort of the middle person. And I think I don't know if Open Collective or Tidelift have like a sort of sales business development person who they reach out to maintainers. They possibly do. But the idea is like, show them the ropes. Like if you're going to take a bunch of money in Open Collective, like what do you do with it? Like there should be some training, and I'm pretty sure they do have something. I just never been a maintainer with a bunch of funding.
Yeah.
But definitely worth looking at to them for. But I even toyed at the idea of like, what if we had a system of agents or experts to like shepherd folks? And honestly, at GitHub, we actually pitched this a few times. Like, what if there was a role to be the PM for some of the top open source projects that didn't have a backing? So like you think of like, actually everyone I'm thinking of like has taken funding eventually or something, which is like what Hoodie had to go through. Like you had to build a company to figure out how to build a sustainable thing. But like, what if you could just partner with an organization? And honestly, I think like the GitHub Accelerator is one of those.
That's great.
The things that came out of it, which is you now have a cohort of projects that have no funding that could take funding, could be a foundation, could just continue to do open source. But like, at least they have a next step and they go through 12 weeks of training to come out the end of it of like, should this be a company or should it just be like a foundation, or should we just set up consulting?
Yeah.
And that's a thing that they get to explore through the program.
Yeah, that's very meaningful work. Yeah.
Yeah, but speaking of which, we got to wind this down. I appreciate you coming out and having this conversation. I'm looking forward to benefiting from a lot of your work continually, a lot of your open source contributions, and
I'm cheering for the sidelines, and I'm your man on the inside.
Yeah.
So, very happy. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, pleasure. And folks, stay saucy.
Stay saucy.